Sneak peek for Season 2 coming up. Just a quick note about the Intelligent Speech Conference 2022. Details in the show description. This year's theme, Crossings, means it features long-lost information about gumbo, from me of course, history about Georgia, the country, not the state, and exploding New Jersey history, among many other topics. It's a chance to have new conversations with new people about new things from your favorite comfy chair. I look forward to seeing you there. Now for the preview. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. Season 2 will cover approximately the first 2/3 of the 18th century, right up to the doorstep of the Revolutionary War. I will look at what happens when English food and Old World cultures are creolized, as new foods invade the North American pantry and contribute to the way the colonists think about themselves. We'll stop at the major destabilizations that lead up to the war, and Season 3 is when I will examine that chaos. So come back to your place at the table, and let's dig into the new century. The first thing you need to know is that on a per-head basis, colonial North America was unusually literate compared to much of the Old World where the colonizers came from. By the 18th century, with the support of the spread of the printing press, the written word was elbowing out previous habits of an oral culture. In the developing New England colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut, the religious separatism, which emphasized the need for all members to commune directly with their God, made basic literacy paramount. The nonconformist leanings of the Quakers and others in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania also led the new inhabitants of the growing colonies to value the ability to read the words of the Geneva Bible for themselves. The foreign Protestant weirdos out of Sweden, the squabbling principalities, and states that were vaguely known by the English as Bavaria, Prussia, and Bohemia also valued direct contact with their holy books and basic numeracy for the purpose of trade and tending to a prosperous farm. Further south, Virginia was lousy with second and third sons of noble or gentry families, as well as various and sundry adventurers. The first group received schooling as a consequence of their position at birth. The second group was literate by way of the necessity of writing letters and reports to petition for and justify investment by royal personages, and others with spare cash to invest. The writings of John Smith and Richard Hakluyt fall under this category. The key to success and riches in Virginia was owning land, growing tobacco, and acquisition of labor to continue and expand cultivation. This required a decent grasp of letters and numbers. It also led to the education of any likely person of the lower sort because labor was so tight. Not to be too trite, but consider the access to education Alexander Hamilton had, as an orphan of an absent father and mother whose virtue was in question. The kid was bright, and the landlord/merchant needed an accountant. Birth didn't matter. Ability did. And that was the common thread to recruiting and training talent all during the earliest colonial period. Even women were taught to keep accounts when things got tight enough. In North Carolina, as a wild frontier focused on land clearing and claiming, literacy was less regarded, though not completely ignored. But self-sufficiency at this point was the watchword rather than trade or severe piety. South Carolina, as a refugee colony for Caribbean planters and French Huguenots, more of those foreign Protestant weirdos, so they had a regard for literacy closer to that of the Old World, where the ruling class was de rigueur literate and numerate, though once again with a limited labor pool. Anyone talented enough was provided with education to keep the wheels of trade rolling. A combination of wanting to keep up appearances with the Old World and the insertion of the Protestant spirit of the Huguenots meant that semi-literate girls were also considered essential. They needed to be able to produce displays of food and fashion up to the standards of the Old World and see to the spiritual health of their families, both for the sake of the souls and the social reputations of husbands they would marry and any future children they would be raising. The Dutch enclave of Old New Amsterdam, now New York, They were always unusually literate. Schooling for boys and girls in basic literacy and numeracy was typical regardless of class, and was even part of the education of orphans. In a country that required industriousness to stay above water, literally, and competency when it came to keeping accounts, running trading firms, and sailing ships, yet had a limited population, it was essential that no mind was wasted. That tradition continued along the banks of the Hudson River. Stuff is going on in La Florida and that French entrepot at the end of the Mississippi River, but those are foreign countries full of Catholics and their popery, so out of our ken for now. All of this concern for Protestant self-determination and social display meant that compared to the general mass of late 17th and early 18th century British peasantry, the new residents of North America, whether born abroad or born of foreign parents on New World shores, they were much more literate and numerate. The reasons for their unusually high literacy were varied, but in the end it meant that the written word as a method of mass communication was more useful in pre-America than it was in most of Europe at this point. One might reasonably point out that there were more languages than English happening in the New World. Heck, North Country English versus London English were even at odds. So wouldn't each language enclave be cut off? Not as much as you might think. Being polyglot or multilingual was much more common in North America in those days than it is now. I mean, sure, the verb tenses might get all mangled, but for example, shipboard life, even from the days of Phoenician sailors and Greek traders bopping about the Mediterranean, or Viking ships plying the fishing grounds and rivers of Northern Europe, all these boats were regularly crewed by men with different birth tongues. You just figured out how to communicate. As a result, by the 18th century, the mixing of people, when you went to start a new life on far shores, it was just expected that you'd have to pick up some new words in a new language. And don't forget the trade languages that existed between the native tribes, and that they were learning French and English to trade furs for items like metal blades and pots and firearms and wool cloth items. At the same time, millions of West Africans were creating new methods of communication as they were tossed together into groups of mismatched languages, as well as having to learn English to survive. As a result, large numbers of new arrivals in North America, along with the locals, were all starting out with a birth language that was one thing, but they'd all learned to stumble about okay in a few others. It was in the 18th century that the written word became the standard in two areas, trade and religion. And based on the goals of the earliest colonists and adventurers, trade and religion were simply the most important things overall. And over time, what was important became what was written down. The link between these two things, like many other things I've talked about, is not a straight line. But the written word, mattering more than oral culture, was certainly helped by the higher than average literacy rates. It was also moved along by the fact that everyone seemed to agree that the only way to get information reliably from one side of the Atlantic to the other was as written documents. Up against this prejudice for the written word, the oral traditions of the societies Europeans were plundering and colonizing would be erased, denigrated, disregarded, and in some cases, completely buried. Where religion was concerned, there were two separate reactions. If a written language did exist, as happened multiple times with the Catholic Church in Central and South America, it was eradicated so as not to interfere with church teachings. But if there was no written language, one was often developed by both Catholic and Protestant sects alike to, yes, facilitate the teaching of the Christian Bible. Now, this is not a linguistics podcast, but I felt it was important to bring up the fact that the English and European colonial attitude towards languages has varied wildly over time. Sometimes other languages are to be learned, at other times they are to be stamped out. The struggle between the written word and oral tradition is also part of the development of American culture. And because American food history, lies in both written and oral culture, it is important to point this out. Oral culture affects what is written down, and what is written down affects the stories we tell ourselves and each other. And at least in the mobile culture of America, where new pieces are added all the time, forgotten lore is recovered and made-up stuff bounces around like crazy if it's catchy. Oral and written culture continually influence each other. Tracing the best-known food history becomes much easier starting in the 18th century because of the higher relative literacy rates of the colonists. They wrote stuff down, and I and other people can read it now. But because of the shifting feelings about oral cultures and the development of new written versions of oral cultures, both in the past and now, it creates interesting tangents within food history studies, which does finally get us all the way back to food. While the 17th century colonists grudgingly adopted maize or Indian corn, pumpkins and persimmons to survive, and were not just willing but able to consume more fish and deer but fewer eels and sheep than their class compatriots back in England, the cooking methods and spicing were firmly bounded within the English cooking rules, and both groups still weren't cool with raw vegetables. But by the 18th century, the space, the copious wood bounty, and the plant foods of the Americas were shifting the colonial diet. They had bigger houses. It wasn't just the rich that had 2 rooms anymore. Communities were larger, and they had more even ratios of women and men. The local technology base was growing, and a more dependable ship traffic from one side of the Atlantic to the other meant more food innovations. The fact that faster boats and more British boats were making the trips to the Far East, Cathay, Macau, and the Spice Islands as they were known then, contributed to more interesting food happening. And the generally high literacy rates meant more recipes and thoughts about food were simply written down. It makes my job much easier in terms of tracking information down, but harder in sorting it out into a coherent storyline. But for the purposes of what is going to happen this season, a bunch of foods are added to the American menu. Most of them had made appearances at some point in the 17th century, but just as novelties or curiosities or something one rich guy was growing in his garden, not as things that changed how people ate or shared recipes at large. Pineapples appear, as do tomatoes, rice, potatoes, and peppers. Jamaican pepper or allspice moves in. Saffron, lemons, and oranges show up in much larger amounts. Milling technology improves, as does wheat growing, so bran as an ingredient separate from wheat flour starts to make a splash. Sugar becomes more generally available, and the American sweet tooth for sugar and other things starts to make itself really known. Tea, both green and black, show up in more places, and coffee is now being grown in the Caribbean along with Brazil, so it has a definite presence as well. The home and kitchen help situation transforms once again, so expectations of what the housewife should be able to do also shifts. Beer gets better, and distilled liquors are more common, as are other items that require new metal thingies. In fact, all sorts of manufacturing starts to establish itself in North America. The labor shortage inspires 2 different types of solutions. Virginia and South, where growing is the main method of production, the importation of human labor becomes the solution. But in the colonies north of Virginia, the American fascination with mechanizing as many tasks as possible begins in earnest. And not just the new manufacturing tasks, but old household and farmyard tasks as well. Bread ovens come inside, new cooking tools are available, and the arrangement of the fireplace starts to become more efficient as bricks are made locally instead of being imported from England, and chimney technology is improved. The good British citizens on the far shores of the New World were developing all this new cooking tech, but they still looked to England and France for instruction in style. The colonists were starting to be open to new flavors and foods from afar, but they were more likely to find them acceptable and fashionable if they had been filtered through British cuisine. Simply going out and learning about the American bounty directly was left to the Africans that cooked their food, and to a limited extent the frontier breakers who picked up tidbits like sassafras tea, prairie onions, and pemmican. The whole 17th century scheme of raw materials shipped to England and then British-made goods shipped back to North America just wasn't satisfactory for the colonists. The spokes of Sidney Mince's rimless wheel were scrapped. The timber of New England built a North American shipping fleet that had serious objections to many of the British trade rules. These sailors, shipmasters, and merchants thought of themselves as British men, sailing British ships and selling British goods to the British Empire. Yet they were taxed differently and required to go through London-side merchant bottlenecks that robbed them of profits back in jolly old England. Sugar, tea, pineapples, tobacco, cod, flax, and paper are all going to contribute to the downfall of the tidy little "you grow 'em, we sell 'em" scheme those first adventurers had thought they were setting up in the 17th century. So join me for Season 2 to see what everyone was eating as they became revolutionary. Thanks for listening. Please check out the show description for links for Intelligent Speech on June 25th. I have a discount code, FOOD. It really would be fun to see some of you there. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Even if you don't feel like writing a whole review, your star ratings on your favorite podcast widget does make this show more findable, so please take a few seconds to express your thoughts in gold stars. And if you have time, leave a review. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll include any interesting media I consumed for this episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.